Hi everyone. Today is Monday, happy Monday, and I'm going to do a 15-minute little video lecture on the Chapter 13 content. Today I want to talk about two mood disorders, depression and bipolar disorder. We left off doing neurodevelopmental disorders, ADHD and autism and schizophrenia on my last video, and today I'll have just enough to kind of go over the gist of these two. And I'll keep working my way through the chapter like that. I also want to add some content that's not really well discussed in the chapter, and that will be particularly the difference between psychopathology and sort of sociopathic tendencies, so psychopaths versus sociopaths. So I'll add some content like that too. But for this morning, as I said, the two mood disorders I want to cover is the major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. So we're not talking about just, clinical depression. We're talking about what the DSM refers to as a major depressive disorder. So there are other types of mood disorders, and there are different types of bipolar as well, but we'll just kind of talk about them holistically today. So I think it's important with depression that we acknowledge that everyone experiences bouts of depression or sadness. That's really quite typical. But it's really about whether or not these things become chronic and intense and ongoing, I guess, is the real difference. Lots of people can have, moods of up and down. And certainly when bad things happen and things are stressful, that strain can cause us to feel these bouts of sadness. But if the symptoms become severe, and I'm looking at your chapter, page 317 for this material, if you see severe symptoms, poor appetite, not able to get out of bed, a lot of sleeping, a lot of agitation, really unable to cope, unable to concentrate, can't make decisions, feeling like, they are a failure, even slow motor activity, just moving slowly, not capable of kind of your typical up and out and showered and movement, all the way through to suicide attempts. So if it gets really severe, sometimes you'll even see psychotic behaviors or psychotic tendencies. And by that means, those really atypical behaviors. So it could be the way that they're talking and the things that they're talking about. It won't seem typical. They will imagine that everything that has happened to them is because of their own wrongdoing. They may describe situations like feeling like they are rotting inside, they're unworthy, that they have guilt for things that they probably didn't really even do. Their perceptions are off. So those are what we call delusions, psychotic behaviors of delusions or hallucinations. Hallucinations are things that aren't there, seeing things that aren't there, and delusions are more perceptions that aren't accurate, they're distorted. So that can all be part of major depressive disorder. And then the textbook goes on to talk about, why these things happen. And they usually break it down into the different perspectives, which we learned about in the very first chapters of psychology. Like the different clinicians and different researchers will come at it from a different perspective. Is this genetic, biological? Is this psychological in terms of cognition and thinking and brain neurotransmitters and stuff like that? Is it a combination of biopsychosocial, so a little bit of our biology, our DNA, a little bit about our life experiences and the way our brains work and think, and also the cultural and social perspective of our environment and how we've grown up and, the situations we're in. And that's usually where almost all researchers land, is it the combination. So there are some links, some correlation between genetic factors. There's a lot of factors on how people cope and how people perceive stress, where they attribute the things that have happened to them in their lives, whether or not they believe that, they have an external locus of control and this is all beyond them and the world's just out to get them and there's nothing they can do about it, or they have deeply wounded self-esteems, like the humanistic perspective, where they're worthless and basically no good, and they have these deep-seated beliefs that they can't change their life, it can't get better, and it's hopeless. So that's a little bit kind of the background, and there's been lots of research studies to try to identify like what causes these things. And as I've always said, causation is nearly impossible to prove, but these are the variables. These are the things that could potentially explain it, but not the same for everyone, It's a real combination of nature-nurture, for sure. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about for depression. And when we get into chapter 14, we'll talk a lot about treatments. And right off the cuff, most people know it's a combination of things like good diet, exercise, social supports, medication, getting out, getting vitamin D, good nutrition. Like there can be a variety of things that can help. Medication is usually the go-to for depression and bipolar, but it can't be the only thing. There has to be other things, including therapy, something called cognitive behavioral therapy, how we change the way you think in order to change the way you behave. But more to come on that in chapter 14. So I got ahead of myself. There's a little bit of the data from the chapter, some of the psychomotor retardation. That just basically means slow motor activity. Some of the stats in Canada, definitely higher among Canadian women. Different stats in different provinces. More about that in your chapter. The majority of people who do experience this will have most of the symptoms I talked about, but there's only a minority of those who will actually experience the psychotic behaviors such as delusions and hallucinations. They're more rare. And when you start to see those, that's when a clinician really needs to look at, is this major depressive disorder and bipolar, or is it just one? And that's why mental health is so complicated, trying to figure out exactly what disorder and what condition does an individual have, and where does one end and another possibly begin. And so you'll often hear a term called concurrent disorders, where you have more than one that kind of run together and bleed into one another, so to speak. So I have about 7 minutes to talk about bipolar disorder, and I always go back to that spectrum, that range of kind of where you are on the spectrum of severity and symptomology. Basically, bipolar is a severe mood disorder that really has two extremes. You are usually elated and manic, excited and high energy and talking fast and, really restless almost, and often reckless as well. Or on the other side, you have deep depression, and it's very scary for people with bipolar. They usually like to be in the manic state because they feel, they might feel delusional about like the world is great and the world's my oyster and I've got this all figured out and I can do this and I can do that. And then all of a sudden they crash. And those are called cycles. So a manic episode is the cycle of elation, and then the depressive cycle is when they crash, so to speak, and will become lethargic and tired and just deep depression. Much of the symptoms I talked about a few minutes ago with major depression disorder. So the cycle is usually 1 to 2 times a year. People will experience those. There are some people who have bipolar that do rapid cycling, and that will mean they might have 4 or 5 episodes a year where they're manic and then depressed and manic and depressed. The thing that people need to not confuse is that they don't flip in the moment. They're not flippant like that. And a lot of people say, oh, she's bipolar, he's bipolar, because they're moody and they switch moods a lot. Well, no, that might be something entirely different, but this is more based on episodic behavior. If someone is manic for a couple of months and all of a sudden crashes and can't get out of bed, that's more likely a bipolar diagnosis. And always, of course, with depressive state, there's the risk of suicide, just like there is with major depression. Some stats for Canada, although these are probably a little bit obviously outdated 2012. I haven't looked at the 2019 numbers, 2020 numbers, but I would suspect that they are all higher. That curve tends to be where we are in terms of mental illness in the country. And to talk a bit about the reason for this, explaining bipolar. A lot of people believe there's the genetic component, that you inherited the trait. Some people will refer to it as neuroticism. It's a characteristic that you probably got maybe from your family. You might have inherited it. But neurotic behavior, that highly anxious kind of behavior, when it's persistent in your life, I often believe too that if you grew up around people who had neurotic behavior, you might have got it genetically, but you also probably got it by experience with personalities like that. If you have parents who are highly aroused like that and flippant like that, there's probably a good chance you're similar. Whether that's because you have their blood or not, I can't say. But I also noticed that, kids who are raised by parents who are pretty calm and rational and logical and have, that kind of linear thinking, the kids tend to be that way too. So when we say genetics, I think we also have to consider environment as equally as important as genetic. There's some studies on the brain. You guys know about serotonin as a neurotransmitter. A lack of serotonin has been connected to bipolar, the brain not being able to create enough serotonin. And so one of the medications that a lot of clinicians will give for bipolar disorder is something called an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So if you're not producing enough serotonin, or it's getting in the synapse and not being taken up by the next neurotransmitter so that it can communicate through the neurons of the brain, and you need a drug to open up the next neuron so it will pick it up from the end bulbs and carry it through, right? If you're going back to the neurotransmitters and neurons, how that works, you may need an SSRI for that. And SSRIs are often given for psychotic disorders as well as mood disorders. And they don't work well if you're drinking while on them and if you don't take them consistently and the right dosing and all of that. So those are some things to think about. There's also something called learned helplessness, and that basically means we've seen a connection with people who have low serotonin levels, done in rat studies and then knowing that it translates to human studies. There's a helplessness or hopelessness that sort of becomes their way of living and believing that they can't change the situation and they're not capable of, doing things better, doing things differently, that this is just the cards they've been dealt and they don't have the capacity to overcome. They don't have the skills, they don't have the attitude, they don't have the thought processes because they perceive from such a negative deficit lens. And it's not like you can just tell someone, snap out of it and don't think like that. There's connections to everything from the way they were born to the way they were raised to the way their brain now processes serotonin, to how their brain is wired and connected. All of the things that we've learned throughout the semester was built to kind of get you to a point when you start learning this material that it should all make sense given what we've learned. I think I've spoke about most of this. There are cognitive factors, the way people think, this belief in everything having to be perfect. And if they grew up in a household where there was a lot of pressure that they were never good enough, it wires the brain to be like that. And it's hard to kind of unwire the brain, which is why we do cognitive behavioral therapy and medication and all kinds of other things to try to rewire, so to speak, not literally, but figuratively, where we try to undo what we've known and what we've learned and alter that. And with medication, if we're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, we're altering the way you think and behave. And if we're doing a medication treatment as well, we're also altering your serotonin levels to try to help people be able to cope. So anyway, that's where I'll end today. My time runs out so fast. Great resources online to read. The textbook is only the tip of the iceberg. There's lots more you can read about these diagnoses. Suicide is something that you should also read. That's in the chapter that comes right after this section, particularly on page 322. Read about the myths, to dispel some of those myths, and to acknowledge that it's highest among men, particularly older men, middle age, and youth. That's all for now. That's all for today. I'll pick up where I left off tomorrow. Bye for now.